Hello and welcome back to Hypatia's Lantern. This week we're talking about libertarianism. It's such a fascinating philosophy, full of contradictions and contrasting beliefs. But what is libertarianism? To put it simply, libertarianism takes the state of nature from liberalism and believes that unlike liberalism, we have no duty to surrender our executive rights in exchange for the trappings of civilization. We have no moral obligation to fund the state from our taxes, no obligation to act towards the benefit of our fellow people. To many, this philosophy seems juvenile, and yet to others, it seems to be the only moral way to build our society and run a successful nation. Much of a current discussion around libertarianism is centred on the ideal of what we would call the night watchman state, an artful phrase that conveys what the state is supposed to be, a limited, albeit powerful state that has its duties restricted to ensuring the borders are kept safe, the rule of law protected, and the budget balanced. Some libertarian groups will add competencies, but the general gist of the philosophy is as limited a government as possible. Critics of libertarianism often say that this is an antiquated way of looking at things, and truth be told, it is. This conception is rooted in the earliest implementations of the state after the Peace of Westphalia established the modern state system in 1648. Those early states, up until the late 1800s, performed the night watchman role, and for the most part, stayed away from doing anything that wasn't in their competencies. The problem is that, for nearly the entirety of those 2 centuries, life for the common person was horrific. And whilst libertarians today insist it will not be like that, many critics say that is exactly what a libertarian state would become. We've previously discussed modern implementations of capitalism, and it has come up several times that under the new economic consensus, the state has retreated from an active role in the economic sphere, and even partially within the social sphere. We've been coming closer and closer to the idea that libertarians wish to implement. Frankly, though libertarians are incredibly idealistic and incredibly utopian in their outlook, as the past 40 years has shown, when the state retreats from what is now considered its obligations, private capital storms headfirst into the space left behind, and that before anyone says it, has not resulted in the betterment of the human condition. In theory, this works. Things like private roads, private security, private healthcare work. In practice, the reality is sadly very different. Fundamentally speaking, not having a secure road network destroys the very foundations of trade and upon it, commerce and civilization. Not having a reliable, fair and blind justice system destroys the very conception of living in an age of justice, and instead takes us back to where might was literally right. Not having reliable healthcare means that the very conception of life itself is under threat. A libertarian often tries to take the absolutist position that taxation is immoral because it compels without a say, because we do not get to choose precisely how our money is spent, and to a point this idea would be right, except what replaces it is almost always even worse. We go from having some say due to our electoral process to having no say at all and being told we either pay to play or have no right at all. This may seem right if you see yourself as the big fish in this situation, but sadly for everyone else, this nightmare would be never ending, and as every 6-year-old watching The Phantom Menace learned, there is always a bigger fish. In some ways, you can argue that the surrender of individual rights is justified because of a social contract. Rawls argued this in his theory of justice, and my view largely aligned with Rawls on this. The fundamental concept of surrendering some individual rights in favour of collective good is an attractive one for me, simply because I, through my lived experience, have grown up in what would be called an adverse socio-economic environment. I am well aware of what happens when the have-nots have no protection. So it makes perfect sense to me that we band together to protect each other from the vicissitudes of capitalism. Indeed, you could say the very foundations of society as we know it are founded on that exact principle. That the very first farmers on the Tigris and the Euphrates, on the Yellow and Yangtze rivers, form their permanent dwellings around their farms and banded together to protect each other. This trend has been common from time immemorial, from the very first city-states to the larger territorial blocks to supranational unions. The tale of humankind is also a tale of people banding together and recognising that we as a collective prosper far better when we work together rather than living in the most individualistic of fashions. I suppose one way to insulate from the anarchic state of nature would be to enforce some form of even distribution of goods, wealth and land. But then, are we not falling into communism? Or at least a communist start point? To most libertarians, the forced redistribution of land in such a fashion would be an anathema simply because it creates that original sin, as you would say, that destroys their idea of the right to property. I'll put it to you that most libertarians don't see themselves as the citizen farmer who owns their plot of land, lives modestly, and simply continues living. They see themselves as the paterfamilias, the king of this patch of dirt, and likely as not, as the rich man who can simply say piss off to anyone who comes calling. There is no obligation to help, no good Samaritan laws, no social pressure. I've got mine, you get yours, or get out. Now imagine, just imagine, that your child is sick, but because your harvest has failed for 3 years due to regional over-farming, you can't afford a doctor, because you live on subsistence farming. And you go from door to door, begging for help, and those that can, refuse. This is a reality for most people in a libertarian state, because the very ideas of mutual protection, of mutual aid, are not only frayed, but severed entirely. This might seem like a good idea when you're not the one who is sick, but as the United States frequently demonstrates, having insurance is simply not enough. We may all die, but to die unnecessarily because we choose not to help, that to me seems unconscionable. Perhaps to a libertarian, such a concept is acceptable, but that only lasts until they need it. Then an exception in their mind exists because they are deserving. The same way that Ayn Rand, who rallied against government help, claims social security. The same way right-wing women who want to ban abortion often undergo abortions themselves. Is it to say that we trust the state entirely? Absolutely not. Libertarians do have a fair point that indeed the citizenry must always keep a watchful eye on the government and ensure that what powers are given are used carefully. Having said that, my take on the issue is it isn't to say that government is wrong, simply that trusting the humans who work for the government implicitly is wrong. I think therein lies the subtle difference between libertarianism and other systems. To libertarians, all forms of government are inherently bad, whether it results in a net positive or not. The simple fact that it is a government is the issue. Whereas for others, myself included, it is not the government that is the problem for the most part, but trusting the people who run the government. We are all infallible human beings, and I do not trust that another infallible human being would be able to not act and not use powers, hence the belief in having powers regulated and subjected to oversight. However, I, like many others, do not view the state as an inherently evil entity. It is an incredibly subtle distinction, and I do appreciate that. However, failing to see that distinction is where libertarians fall down. In the modern world, the need for a night watchman state has long since passed. It is a relic that doesn't fit within the accepted responsibilities of the state and how the populace view our society. Indeed, the Libertarian candidate in the US presidential election made a big show of demonstrating how neither candidate is fit for office. But digging just below the surface, you find things like libertarians saying it is okay for men and women to be paid differently. In theory, this is justified because according to libertarian principle, the state has no authority to interfere within private businesses. In theory, the most innovative businesses will survive, so those that are inclusive, those that hire women and pay them better. But in practice, this is simply not the case. If now, with all of our rules and regulations, and still the freedom to buy elsewhere exists, why then does discrimination still exist? It follows that removing those rules and regulations would simply allow employers to discriminate freely again, and that would eradicate nearly a century's worth of progress in advancing the rights of women and other minorities. Another important point is that libertarianism has no answer for the crisis. Throughout the history of every state, crises have erupted, be they war, famine, social and civic unrest, disease, and so on. The flexibility of the state to adapt to the crisis determines whether that state survives. An inflexible state does not survive. A state without the tools to deal with the crisis either creates those tools, or they too will pass into history. A good example of this is the Achaemenid Persian Empire. When Alexander stormed in from Macedon, the empire simply did not have the tools to deal with the invasion, and that led to the end of that empire. Going further back, you can also point to the ancient Sumerians who fell to progressively lower crop yields and invasions from nomadic tribes. Those that cannot adapt fall. How does this fit into libertarianism? Well, let's put our current topical crisis into the libertarian conception of the state. We are facing the biggest public health crisis since the Spanish flu outbreak in the aftermath of the First World War. It is a disease that has broken loose and spread out across the planet. To combat this pandemic requires a two-pronged approach. First, to delay the spread of the virus, to ensure that hospitals are not overrun, and secondly, to buy time so that the second prong, a vaccine, can be found. However, this requires more than a voluntary buy-in, because those few who would normally flout the rules are now putting a serious risk upon their community. Normally, that sort of risk can be absorbed. However, in the face of a virulent and deadly killer, that simply isn't possible. This requires draconian measures, which will infringe on personal liberty. First, for a libertarian to accept this is almost an impossibility. The libertarians in the US have instead broken social distancing rules, refused to wear masks, and protested violently against these restrictions. Ideologically, libertarians consider it inherently unethical to force these restrictions on people, even though it may save their lives. Now, it is one thing to deny someone agency over their own life. However, what libertarians don't consider is that because of the nature of this crisis, because of the nature of this virus, refusing to social distance doesn't just make a decision for them, it makes a decision for other people too. Because this virus spreads so, if you refuse to wear a mask, you risk spreading to someone else. Because this virus spreads so, if you refuse to socially distance, you risk spreading to someone else. Because this virus spreads so, if you protest, you risk spreading to someone else. That person may not survive. They may pass it on to their elderly parents, their spouse, their children, all of whom may be crippled for life or not survive. Where is your respect for their rights? Putting aside the ethics of it, in terms of practicality, does a libertarian state even have the tools to handle a public health crisis? It is an assumption that they do, and yet they simply do not. Whilst libertarian states are incredibly powerful in their few, limited competencies, the requirements of a national lockdown or anything resembling it, or indeed any of the measures of a public health crisis, simply do not exist in a libertarian state. From smallpox to cholera to outbreaks of a bubonic plague, night watchman states in the 18th and 19th centuries were simply unable to handle the situation because the critical infrastructure, from public health departments to police to emergency legislation, simply did not exist. Every action would be reactive and bitterly debated in a fashion that undermines the very existence of countermeasures. For example, setting up a temporary emergency hospital would require discussions to man it, with doctors and nurses alike, depending entirely on whether you could conscript doctors and nurses and administrators for such a purpose. It also requires legislation in place to handle that process, as well as the funding to do so. The speed at which it is necessary to act requires those things to be in place, an established and adaptable plan. Part of where the United Kingdom, which has had an appalling pandemic response, went wrong is that for the past decade, the party of government has spent their time slashing funding and resources allocated to emergency powers. This led to a situation where understaffed and under-resourced public health officials were simply unable to roll out enough countermeasures to stem the tide until the Prime Minister caught the virus and his government started to take the pandemic seriously. In a night watchman state, because none of that critical infrastructure exists, it is simply impossible, and trying to set it up on the fly will result in continuous missteps. I can already imagine the libertarian response of, humans survived this already, we're still here. But that's the thing. I've been to the catacombs of Paris and stood amongst the bones of those who died of plague, stood atop ruins of civilizations brought down by disease or famine or instability. I've read history and even in my own lifetime seen what happens when states fail to adapt to changing circumstances. It is not a case of humankind surviving, but the stories of those who did not. We all know what causes these tragedies. We know how to slow their dreadful march, so it is inherently unjustified to think that we should, or even could, tolerate the mortality levels seen in past epidemics and pandemics. During the major outbreak of the bubonic plague, what we refer to as the Black Death, in a 4-year period, it ravaged Europe to the point where it is estimated between 30 to 50% of the population died. Let's just take the lower number. Look at your friends and family and imagine that a third of them just die. Imagine the immense human cost of this. Never mind the economic cost, just the human cost. Now imagine this happens again and again and again, and the reason is because you refuse to do what must be done. You choose to allow this virus to spread. You choose to refuse to put in place restrictions which would stop it dead in its tracks. Is this morally justified? Is it ethically justified? I would say that it is not. To choose to allow a pandemic to spread because you refuse to empower the state because you consider it tyrannical is the height of stupidity. And this is the fundamental flaw of libertarian ideology. That which survives on paper falls down utterly when put into practice. This idea isn't futuristic or even forward-thinking. We moved on from this because it is inadequate for how we view the prism of human existence. It fails fundamentally at its objectives of keeping the populace safe. For all Ayn Rand or Rand Paul or George Jorgensen wanted to talk about libertarianism, it is telling that none of them can ever practically answer the challenges brought against libertarianism, because there aren't any answers. It is the philosophy of the I'm alright, screw everyone else. It is the ideology of the selfish, the refuge of the intellectually lazy, and the realm of the fantasist. What does it matter if drugs are legal, if you are subject to every single negative effect of capitalism without amelioration, regulation, or protection? It is the embodiment of the state of nature, the collapse of civilization, and the antithesis of what it means to be human. It brings to my mind the old words spoken in the Malian dialogue: the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. This is no way to order a society, no way to structure civilization, and no way to create mutual and lasting prosperity. To understand the underlying issue with libertarianism, you have to ask yourself, what does it mean to govern? Why do we have a government? The government exists for two reasons: to keep us safe and to ensure the rule of law. This stems from our earliest conceptions of civilization. The early rulers came about as a means of ordering society, to prevent the blood feud system of justice from continuing as our norm. If you look at the earliest civilizations in our history, you find legal codes. If you look at ancient Egypt, you find their pride and joy being their legal code. Same with ancient China or Sumer. This is not an isolated situation. Everywhere we look, it is when the government loses control of the rule of law that the government usually loses its legitimacy. How does this relate to the problem with libertarianism? To guarantee the rule of law, you have to ensure the citizenry buys into it. A citizenry that has access to justice, to opportunity, and to prosperity is a citizenry that obeys the rule of law. It is a citizenry that has no cause and no reason to revolt or seek extrajudicial means. This is in effect the social contract. We allow authority to the government in exchange for the guarantee that these powers are used for our security and benefit. The competencies of our government have expanded because who we consider citizenry has also expanded. We no longer govern primarily for rich white aristocrats. We govern, at least nominally, for all the people of our nation. When our conception of who we govern for has expanded, so too has the need of the government to ensure citizenry that has access to justice, to opportunity and prosperity. Attempting to revert back to a night watchman state and reverse the competencies of a government is a tacit acceptance that the people who depend on those organs of the government simply aren't worth our time. This kernel at the very heart of libertarian thought is a fundamental flaw. You simply cannot have an effective government that fulfills its duties to the people with a night watchman state. There is no method, no means for such a state to meet those core demands, because despite what libertarians say, the end result is always the same: a reversion to the doctrine of might being right. In some ways, you can say that libertarianism is like salt to a dish. A small amount and it seasons really well. Too much and you kill the dish, rather like the Romans killed Carthage. It is an antiquated idea that simply does not belong in our modern world, and our understanding that all human beings are deserving of liberty, of justice, and of the opportunity to prosper. And on that note, I shall leave it there, because there really isn't much more to be said. I'd love to see your comments, and see you next week where we'll talk about fascism. Thank you, and goodbye.